The snow had already started falling by the time I reached the cabin. I'd been hiking for most of the afternoon, pushing through the uneven terrain, the weight of my pack settling into my shoulders. The cold had been manageable at first, but as the wind picked up and the sun began to set, I could feel it gnawing at my skin. I wasn't worried, though. I knew the cabin was here, an old hunting cabin, isolated deep in the woods. I found it exactly where the map said it would be. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, but it still looked solid enough. I knocked on the door out of habit before pushing it open. The inside was dim, dust swirling in the fading light. It smelled like damp wood and old earth, but it would do. The place wasn't big, one main room with a small alcove for a bed. A rusted-out wood stove sat in the corner, and a crude table with a single chair was against the wall. There were shelves, mostly empty except for a few rusted cans and a stack of brittle newspapers. I dropped my pack on the table and went straight to work gathering firewood. Outside, the temperature had dropped even further, and the snow was coming down harder. I found a few logs stacked near the cabin, half buried under a tarp stiff with frost. They were dry enough. I carried them inside and got a fire going in the stove. The warmth spread slowly, fighting against the cold that had already seeped into the wooden walls. As I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a quiet unease that sat low in my stomach. Maybe it was the isolation, the way the trees pressed in close, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. I ignored it and unpacked my gear, rolling out my sleeping bag on the cot in the alcove. By the time I finished eating, night had fully set in. The wind outside had turned violent, rattling the cabin's thin walls. I listened to it as I lay in my sleeping bag, my body finally starting to thaw from the day's hike. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a sound outside. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, the trees shifting, snow falling from their branches. But then I heard it again, a deliberate, heavy crunch. Footsteps. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the door. The sound had stopped, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone or something was out there. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the door, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the snow. But something about the way it had sounded, slow, steady, too heavy for most animals, kept me on edge. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down, though I didn't sleep well. Every gust of wind, every creak of the old wood made me flinch. When morning finally came, I was relieved to see the first streaks of gray light through the cracks in the walls. I stepped outside, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. The wind had died down, leaving everything eerily silent. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the trees straight to my door. They weren't mine. I crouched down, my breath fogging in the cold air. The prints were deep, spaced far apart. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. But there were no prints leading away. I stood quickly, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just the endless stretch of snow and forest. My skin prickled. Someone had been here. Had they stood outside my door? Listening? Watching? The thought made my stomach twist. I told myself I should leave, but the snow had piled up overnight, making travel difficult. I decided to stay another night. I kept my hatchet close as I gathered more firewood, my eyes constantly flicking to the trees. As the day wore on, I tried to rationalize the footprints. Maybe they had been there before I arrived, half covered by new snowfall. Maybe I had made them myself and forgotten. But deep down, I knew neither was true. That night, I locked the door. Not that it would do much good. A solid push could probably break the old wood. I sat up late, the fire casting flickering shadows against the walls. Every so often, I would turn off my flashlight, listening. The silence was oppressive. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. My grip tightened around the hatchet. The steps moved to the window, stopping just outside. I could feel someone there, just beyond the thin glass. Watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited, my muscles aching with tension. Then, slowly, the steps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed my gear, throwing everything haphazardly into my pack. I stepped outside, heart hammering. The snow was disturbed all around the cabin. The prints circled it several times before disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait to see where they led. I started hiking, pushing myself through the deep snow, barely stopping to catch my breath. After a few miles, I finally glanced back. The cabin was a dark smudge in the distance, barely visible through the trees. That's when I saw him, a figure standing just at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far from work, far from my phone, far from everything. I needed the break. I had rented the place online from an old man who assured me it was real quiet up there. That was exactly what I wanted, quiet. No distractions. Just me, the trees, and a few books I had brought along to finally finish. The drive took longer than expected. The road was more of a dirt trail, winding through dense trees that blocked out most of the sun. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, just a simple one-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and a single window that faced the forest. The air smelled damp, like old wood and earth, and the inside had that stale, unused smell that told me no one had been here in a long time. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, started a small fire in the stove, and read until I felt tired. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal noise, not the scurrying of small feet or the snap of a twig. It was a distinct thump, like something heavy being set down on the wooden porch. I held my breath, straining to listen, but everything was silent again. Maybe something had fallen. I wasn't about to get out of bed to check. I forced myself to close my eyes and go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and found something that made my stomach tighten. A single boot sat on the porch, old and weathered, covered in dried mud. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I would have noticed something like that. I looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The woods were still, too still. I grabbed the boot and tossed it into the trees before heading inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been there and I just hadn't seen it. Maybe an animal had dragged it out from somewhere. I told myself it was nothing, but I kept the door locked from then on. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made me jump. Branches shifting in the wind sounded like footsteps. The house settling sounded like someone creeping along the porch. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But then, around 3 a.m, I heard it again. Thump. This time it was louder, closer. I gripped the blanket tightly, staring at the door. Another thump, followed by the creak of the wooden planks. Someone was out there. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the window. Nothing, just darkness and trees. The sound stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my heart hammering, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I found a second boot. This one was right outside the door, perfectly placed. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It matched the first one. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had put it there. I searched the area, looking for footprints, but the ground was covered in thick leaves. Nothing. I considered leaving right then, but I had spent too much money on this trip. I convinced myself it was some local messing with me, maybe some hunter who didn't like outsiders. I decided I wouldn't let them scare me off. That night, I stayed up, keeping the fire going. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, waiting. The hours dragged by, the fire crackled, and my eyes felt heavy. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to complete silence. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the room. The air felt heavy, wrong. Then came the sound. Not a thump this time, but something softer. The sound of breathing, just outside the window. Cold fear crawled up my spine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I could see nothing through the window but blackness. The breathing continued, slow and steady. My mind raced. Who was out there? What did they want? I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so hard my fingers ached. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Morning came, and I found something new on the porch. A pair of jeans, folded neatly. They were old, torn at the knees, stained with something dark. I didn't want to think about what it might be. That was it. I was done. I packed my bag in record time and threw everything in the car. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The door, which I had locked, was standing wide open. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. When I got home, I looked up the rental listing again. It was gone. No trace of it. No contact information for the owner. Nothing. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. Someone had been watching me the entire time. I should have never come out here alone. I knew that the moment I stepped onto the cabin's porch, the wood creaking beneath my boots, the air thick with the smell of damp pine and decaying leaves. The place had been sitting out here for years and used, forgotten. My uncle left it to me after he passed, and I figured I'd come check it out, see if it was worth fixing up or selling. I told myself it would just be a quick weekend trip. Just a few days alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city. But by the time the first night rolled in, I realized how wrong I was. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One bedroom, a tiny bathroom, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a living room with an old wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Dust coated everything. There was no electricity, no running water, just the well out back and the lanterns I'd brought with me. It was isolated, too. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the nearest paved road was a solid 10. Once I shut my truck off and took out the key, I realized how alone I really was. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, nothing but trees in every direction. I spent most of that first day cleaning. The air inside was thick with dust, the kind that made your throat scratchy after breathing it in for too long. The cupboards had been raided by mice at some point, their droppings scattered across the counter, the scent of old urine still lingering. I scrubbed it all down, set out traps, checked the bedding to make sure no animals had nested inside. It was a long, exhausting process, but by the time the sun started setting, I felt a little more at ease. The place still had an eerie stillness to it, but I chalked it up to being out in the middle of nowhere. That night, the forest was loud. It wasn't something I was used to. Back home, the nights were filled with distant traffic and the occasional siren. Out here, it was the chirp of insects, the rustling of trees, the occasional snap of a branch. Normal forest sounds. I kept telling myself that. But there was something else, too. Something faint. A sound I couldn't quite place. Started just after midnight. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, struggling to fall asleep. The mattress was stiff, the air too still, the silence pressing in on me. That's when I heard it. A soft crunching sound. Footsteps? No, probably just an animal. A deer, maybe. Something moving through the underbrush. I forced myself to ignore it, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but the window showed nothing but trees and blackness beyond. I listened, waited. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just my imagination, maybe an animal passing through. Either way, I wasn't about to go outside and check. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were smaller, narrower, barefoot. The sight of them sent a chill through me. They led from the edge of the tree line, stopped right at the porch steps, then turned back the way they came. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell would be out here, barefoot, in the middle of the night? I tried to shake it off. Maybe some local kids messing around, maybe a hunter who got lost. It was unsettling, sure, but I refused to let it get to me. I spent the rest of the day fixing up the place, chopping wood for the stove, checking the well water to make sure it wasn't contaminated. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I told myself I'd sleep better that night. I was wrong. The sound started again around the same time. That slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my breath held tight in my chest. The sound came closer, closer, stopped just outside the cabin. I gripped the flashlight in one hand, the knife I kept in my bag in the other. I waited, listened. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Every muscle in my body went rigid. The cabin door was locked, but the thought of someone, or something, standing just on the other side sent ice through my veins. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating, vanishing into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the door. No signs of forced entry, no damage. But the footprints were back. More of them this time, circling the cabin. My stomach twisted. I knew then that this wasn't some lost hiker or curious kid. Someone was watching me. Someone was coming back, night after night. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I had my knife, I had my truck. I told myself that if anything else happened, I'd get in the truck and drive away, no hesitation. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the living room, knife on my lap, lantern burning low. The hours crawled by. Then, just past 2 in the morning, the sound returned. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, just outside the window. My fingers tightened around the knife handle. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. The breathing moved along the wall, stopping at the door. Then a soft scratch, fingernails against wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the window. Nothing. But I swore I saw something move at the edge of the beam. A shadow slipping back into the trees. That was it. I grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and ran to my truck. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the trees stretching taller, the darkness thickening. I jumped inside, locked the doors, turned the engine over. The headlights flooded the area in front of me, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures standing just at the edge of the trees. They were barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, thin too thin. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires kicking up dirt, then spun it around and tore down the road, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't breathe right until I hit pavement. I drove straight home, never once glancing in the rearview mirror. The next day, I called a realtor and put the cabin up for sale. I never went back. I had always wanted to spend some time alone in a remote cabin. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. After months of planning, I finally found the perfect place. A small, old log cabin deep in the Montana woods. It wasn't part of any rental site. I found it through a friend of a friend, some guy who had inherited it from his grandfather but barely used it. I paid him in cash, and that was that. He didn't even bother drawing up a contract. The cabin was miles from anything. No cell service, no power lines, just an old gas generator and a wood-burning stove. It had 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a sitting area with a fireplace. There was no plumbing, just an outhouse a few yards away. A small creek ran about 50 feet from the front porch, cutting through the thick trees like a silver ribbon. It was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was barely a road at all, just 2 overgrown tire tracks cutting through the trees. My truck barely made it, the tires slipping in the damp earth. When I finally parked, I just sat there for a moment, taking it all in. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. Birds chirped somewhere in the trees, and the creek babbled softly in the background. It was peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the stove, heated up some canned chili, and read by lantern light until I got tired. The silence out here was something else. It wasn't like the quiet you get in a house. It was a deep, absolute silence. No hum of appliances, no distant cars, just the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. But by the second night, that silence felt different. I don't know how to describe it, but something about it felt off. I kept catching myself listening too hard, straining to hear something I couldn't quite place. Maybe I was just getting used to being alone, I told myself. I shook it off and went to bed. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had woken me up. I didn't know what. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, waiting. The fire had burned low, filling the room with faint, flickering light. The silence pressed in around me, and then, from outside, I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the damp earth. I froze. The sound came again, slow, measured. Not an animal. Animals move in bursts, quick and uneven. This was different. Someone was walking outside my cabin. My first thought was that it was a hunter, maybe someone lost, but no one should have been out here. I had driven almost an hour down that dirt road, and the cabin wasn't on any map. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to make the floorboards creak. The rifle I'd brought for protection was propped against the wall. I grabbed it, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. The trees swallowed the light from the moon, and the porch lantern barely illuminated the area right outside the door. But I knew someone was there. I could feel it. I stood there for what felt like hours, barely breathing. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal moving strangely in the night. I went outside, rifle in hand, and checked around the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt near the porch steps. Bare footprints. Human. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Someone had been standing out here in the dark, watching my cabin. Watching me. I thought about leaving, but I had come all this way, and I didn't want to let paranoia ruin my trip. I told myself it was probably some drifter or hermit living off the grid, maybe just curious about my presence. I decided to stay, but I kept my rifle close. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I kept the fire low so I wouldn't be silhouetted in the windows. I lay in bed, the rifle within arm's reach, listening. Sometime after midnight, the footsteps came back. They were slower this time, heavier. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were lingering, listening, watching. Then came the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. A light scraping, like fingers dragging across the wood. It moved around the cabin, circling. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My heart pounded so loud I was sure they could hear it. And then silence. I sat there, every muscle in my body locked in place, waiting. Hours passed. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. I checked outside. More footprints, the same bare feet. They had walked all the way around the cabin. And near the window, carved into the wood with something sharp, was a single word. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed my things in record time, threw everything into the truck, and got out of there. The whole way down that dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching me go. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, or maybe they had something worse in mind. Either way, I never looked back, and I sure as hell never went camping alone again. The road to the cabin was barely a road at all. just a winding dirt path cut through miles of dense forest. The truck's tires kicked up loose gravel as I navigated around potholes, the sun slipping lower behind the treetops. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the GPS had long since lost signal. I kept going, though, following the directions I had written down earlier. It had been a long week at work, and I wanted a weekend to myself. No phone calls, no emails, just me, the quiet, and a couple of days to reset. A buddy had told me about this place. An old hunting cabin tucked deep in the woods, isolated enough that I wouldn't see another soul but comfortable enough to stay in. I rented it for 3 nights, packed enough food and firewood to last, and headed out. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering pine trees. The roof sagged slightly, and the wood was dark and weathered, but it looked sturdy enough. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a rusted-out truck bed leaned against the side like it had been there for decades. I stepped out of the truck, stretched, and took a deep breath. The air smelled damp and earthy, the way forests always do at dusk. The only sounds were the distant chirps of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and a thick stack of firewood was neatly piled beside it. A narrow bed with a faded wool blanket was pushed against the far wall. The floor creaked under my boots as I explored, opening cabinets, checking the sink. No running water, which I expected. I had brought enough bottled water for the weekend. I unloaded my gear, set up a small cooking station on the counter, and lit a fire in the stove. By the time darkness fully set in, I had eaten, cleaned up, and settled into an old wooden chair with a beer in hand. The heat from the stove filled the small space, and for the first time in a long while, I felt relaxed. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something. A noise outside, faint but distinct. A single, deliberate crunch of leaves. I sat up straight, my pulse quickening. The sound hadn't been the wind. It had weight behind it, the kind of sound a boot makes on dry foliage. I listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. Nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon rooting around, but something about it unsettled me. I stood, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and walked to the door. I hesitated before opening it, then stepped onto the porch. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I walked a few steps out, shining the light along the ground, but I didn't see any fresh tracks, just old leaves and dirt. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with me as I went back inside. I bolted the door, double-checked the windows, and made sure the fire was burning strong before lying down in bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every small noise outside made my ears perk up. The wind picked up at some point, branches shifting against each other, but I swore I heard something else, something moving. Slow, careful steps, but every time I sat up and listened, there was nothing. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke up to pale morning light filtering through the trees. The fire had burned low, and the air was crisp. I swung my legs out of bed and rubbed my face, trying to shake the lingering grogginess. Then I saw it. Right outside the cabin, in the dirt just past the porch steps. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Not random patterns left by fallen branches. Clear, human footprints. They led from the tree line toward the cabin and stopped just outside the door. Cold knot twisted in my stomach. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out there, watching, standing just feet away from where I had slept. I threw on my boots and grabbed my knife before stepping outside. The footprints were fresh, the edges still sharp. They were deep too, like whoever made them had been standing there for a while. I followed them backward, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. They led into the trees, weaving between trunks, heading deeper into the forest. I tracked them for about 50 yards before they disappeared into underbrush too thick to follow. Whoever it was, they had been here recently, maybe even while I was awake, watching, listening. I went back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. A hunter? A lost hiker? Someone just messing around? But none of it made sense. The day passed slowly. I spent most of it on edge, checking the tree line every few minutes, expecting to see someone step out from the shadows. But nothing happened. By nightfall, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe the footprints had been there the night before, and I just hadn't noticed them. Maybe they were old. I built the fire up high, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there away. I stayed awake as long as I could, but exhaustion eventually won. The sound that woke me this time was different. Not footsteps, something softer, a scraping noise, slow and deliberate, right outside the wall. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, ears straining. The sound moved, a slow, dragging scrape, like something rough against wood. It circled the cabin, stopping just beneath the window. I sat up, knife in hand, too scared to move. Then a sharp knock. 3 taps against the wall. I bolted out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and flicked it on. I wanted to run, but my body locked up. The knocks came again, harder this time. I forced myself to move, stepping toward the door. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, barely breathing. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, nothing was there, just the empty forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The moment the sun came up, I packed my things, loaded them into the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure, watching me leave. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit pavement, then kept going until I was miles away. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing. Someone had been out there, in those woods, watching me the whole time, and I never should have gone alone. I never wanted to go back to that cabin. Even now, thinking about it makes my stomach tighten. I don't know what made me book that trip in the first place. Maybe I just needed to get away. Work had been draining, and the constant noise of the city was starting to get to me. I needed some space, somewhere quiet where I could be alone for a while. So, I found this cabin online, tucked away deep in the forest, far from any town or major road. It seemed perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. After the last stretch of paved road, I had to follow a winding dirt path for what felt like miles. My tires kicked up dust as I maneuvered around sharp turns and steep drops. The trees pressed in on both sides, and I saw no signs of people. No other cabins, no parked cars, nothing. Just endless forest. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. The cabin itself was simple. 1 story, a porch with a single wooden rocking chair, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was aged and gray, but it seemed sturdy enough. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and stepped onto the porch. As I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the scent of dust and old wood filled my nose. Inside, the air was cool and stale. The furniture was sparse. A small table, a couch that looked as stiff as a board, and a single bed with a thick, scratchy blanket. A few cabinets lined the wall next to a tiny kitchen area, and there was a fireplace made of stacked stone in the corner. It was exactly what I needed. Isolated, quiet, and far from anyone who could bother me. I spent the first couple of hours settling in, unpacking my things and checking the place out. The windows were small and covered in grime, making the inside dim even while it was still light outside. There was no electricity, just an old gas lantern on the table and a stack of firewood near the hearth. I figured I'd make a fire later, but for now I just wanted to rest. I sat on the couch, let out a deep breath, and listened to the silence. Then I heard it, a creaking sound, faint but distinct, coming from outside. I froze. It could have been anything. The wind, an old tree shifting, maybe even an animal stepping on a fallen branch. But it sounded too deliberate, too much like footsteps. Slow, careful, moving across the porch. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound stopped. I waited, listening. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I was alone in an unfamiliar place, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I shook it off and went about my evening, lighting the lantern as the sun disappeared completely. The warmth of the small flame made the room feel a little less lonely. I tried to sleep early, but the bed was stiff, and the blanket smelled like mildew. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to get comfortable. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly to a noise just outside the window. A crunch, like a boot stepping on gravel. I shot up, heart pounding. The window was too dirty to see through clearly, but I could make out movement, a shadow shifting just outside. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was out there, standing just beyond the glass, unmoving. I wanted to believe it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but deer don't wear boots. I reached for my flashlight on the nightstand, turned it on, and shined it at the window. The beam hit the glass, reflecting back at me, but I saw nothing beyond it. The shadow was gone. I swallowed hard. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the hunting knife I had packed, gripping it tightly as I climbed out of bed. The floor creaked beneath me as I moved to the window. I pressed my face close, trying to see beyond the glare of the flashlight. Nothing. I stayed like that for a long time, listening, waiting, but the forest was silent again. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down, keeping the knife close. Sleep didn't come easy, but at some point, exhaustion won out. I drifted off, the lantern still burning beside me. In the morning, I stepped outside to check the area. The ground was damp from a light rain, and I saw them, footprints, clear as day, leading from the edge of the woods to my window. They weren't mine. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my things, threw them into my car, and left without looking back. The entire drive home, my mind kept replaying the same question over and over. Who had been watching me? I had always liked the idea of solitude. That's why I rented the cabin. It was a simple one-room structure deep in the woods, built decades ago by some hunter who had long since stopped coming. The owner, a grizzled old man who ran a small bait and tackle shop in town, had warned me that it wasn't much. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a cot, and a few shelves with dusty old cans of food left behind by previous tenants. That was fine by me. I needed a break. The drive out had been long, the last few miles on a narrow dirt road barely wider than my truck. The trees were thick, leaning in as if they wanted to swallow the path entirely. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting, and the air had that crisp, dry chill of late autumn. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Nothing but the wind in the trees. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no signs of life, just silence. I hauled my supplies inside, checked the place over. It was exactly as the old man had described, bare bones but sturdy. The wood stove in the corner looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, so I set about getting a fire going. I wasn't worried about food. I had brought enough for the week. The plan was simple. No phone, no internet, just me, my notebook, and a chance to reset. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't fear or discomfort, just the unfamiliarity of it. Every groan of the wind against the walls, every creak of the old wooden beams settling, had my ears pricked up. The woods at night are not silent. Small animals rustled through the leaves outside. The occasional snap of a twig made me wonder what was moving out there, but I reminded myself it was just raccoons, deer, maybe even a bear far off. Nothing I hadn't dealt with before. Morning came slow. The fire had died down overnight, and the cold had seeped in. I spent the day chopping wood from the small pile outside, getting a feel for the area. A narrow path wound behind the cabin, leading deeper into the forest. I followed it for a while, marking trees with my knife as I went, not wanting to lose my way. The second night, something changed. I woke up to a sound I couldn't quite place. Not wind, not animals. Something slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It was coming from outside, near the trees. A crunch, then a pause. Another crunch, closer this time. Footsteps. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a lost hiker, but the steps were too controlled, too careful. I sat up slowly, reaching for the small flashlight I had next to my cot. I flicked it on and aimed it at the window. Nothing but trees. The sound had stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. Near the firewood pile, where the ground was still soft from last night's rain, were footprints. Human, barefoot. They led from the tree-line to the side of the cabin, then back the way they came. I felt my stomach tighten. Who the hell walks around barefoot in the middle of the woods at night? I spent the day checking the area, looking for any sign of a camp or another cabin. Nothing, just endless trees in every direction. That evening, I built the fire higher, hoping the light would keep whoever it was away. I double-checked the cabin door. There was no lock, just an old metal latch. I wedged my hatchet under the cot, within arm's reach, and settled in for another long night. The footsteps came back. This time, they didn't stop at the tree-line. I heard them circle the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I gripped the hatchet, my pulse hammering in my throat. The walls of the cabin were thin. If they wanted to, they could break a window, force the door. I held still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. Then 3 soft knocks. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced. A lost hiker? Some local messing with me? But why wouldn't they say something? The knock came again, a little harder this time. Clenched my jaw. No way in hell was I opening that door. I sat there, gripping the hatchet, staring at the door, waiting for whatever came next. After what felt like an eternity, the steps moved away, back toward the trees. I didn't sleep at all. By dawn, I had made my decision. I was getting the hell out of there. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag. As I stepped outside, my skin crawled. More footprints. This time, there were dozens, circling the cabin, coming and going from every direction. I hurried to my truck, threw my bag in the back, and climbed in. The engine wouldn't start. My hands were shaking as I turned the key again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked the battery cables. Someone had cut them. My mouth went dry. I turned, scanning the woods, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. I had 2 choices, wait it out or walk back to town. It was a 10-mile hike, maybe more. I grabbed my pack, my hatchet, and started walking. I moved fast, constantly checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. The woods were too quiet. After about an hour, I heard it. Footsteps off to my right, matching my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I took another step. So did they. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and took off running. Branches whipped at my face, my breath burning in my lungs. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the road. I stumbled out of the trees, gasping, and nearly collapsed onto the dirt. A truck was coming, an old, rusted-out pickup. I waved frantically, and it screeched to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, eyed me warily. "You all right?" I swallowed, nodding too fast. "I need a ride to town." He hesitated but nodded. "Hop in." I didn't look back as we pulled away. I didn't want to see if anyone was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. Back in town, I told the old man at the bait shop about what happened. He listened without saying a word, his face unreadable. When I was done, he exhaled a long breath, then said, "You're not the first. That was the last time I went looking for solitude." I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. I needed it. Work had been relentless, and I hadn't taken a break in what felt like years. So when I finally got a long weekend, I packed up my gear, loaded my truck, and headed out to a remote cabin I had found online. It was miles away from the nearest town, buried deep in the woods, and promised solitude. That was all I wanted. Time alone, away from people, away from noise, away from everything. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally I found myself on what barely passed for a trail. My truck bounced over deep ruts, the tires kicking up dust that hung in the hot afternoon air. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and I liked that. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Just a simple wooden structure, one floor, with a tiny front porch and a fire pit in the yard. The trees pressed in from all sides, their towering trunks forming a thick wall that cut me off from the rest of the world. The nearest property was supposedly 10 miles away. That suited me just fine. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The silence was immediate. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of some unseen bird. I took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, earthy. Felt good to be away from everything. The cabin was unlocked, as promised. The inside was basic, just a bed, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that I quickly realized didn't have running water. That was fine. I had brought enough supplies to last me. I dumped my gear on the bed and went back outside to gather some firewood before it got dark. The forest was dense, and the deeper I went, the more unsettling it felt. The trees here were ancient, gnarled things with twisted roots that seemed to claw at the ground. The canopy was so thick that barely any sunlight made it through, casting everything in a permanent twilight. I tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was stupid. There was no one out here. Still, I hurried, grabbing as much wood as I could carry before heading back. By the time night fell, I had a fire going. I sat by it, eating a quick meal and letting the warmth seep into my bones. The woods were alive with sound now. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful. Then I heard it, a single sharp crack in the woods. Not the sound of an animal moving through the brush, not the wind shaking the trees. It was distinct, the sound of a footstep on a dry branch. I froze, listening. My first thought was that maybe someone had stumbled onto the property by accident, but I knew that wasn't likely. No one came out here. I waited, staring into the darkness, but I didn't hear anything else. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees, but all I saw was the dense forest staring back at me. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I put out the fire and went inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me snap awake. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, I didn't know why. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound. It was close, too close. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembling slightly. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the window. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, a deer, something harmless. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I got up and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds greeting the day. Then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They started at the edge of the tree line and led straight to my cabin. My stomach twisted. I had locked the door. There was no sign of forced entry, but someone had been out here, watching me. I spent the morning checking the perimeter, looking for any more signs of intruders, but found nothing. Still, the unease didn't leave me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. Maybe I had imagined the sounds last night. Maybe I considered leaving, but I had come out here for peace, for solitude. I wasn't going to let some footprints scare me off. That night, I made sure the door was locked tight. I kept my flashlight and a knife within arm's reach. The fire outside burned bright. If anyone was out there, they would see I was awake. Hours passed. I listened, waited. Nothing, just the usual sounds of the woods. Then, at around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I turned off my flashlight, hoping the darkness would hide me. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. I sat there, barely breathing, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then, finally, I heard retreating footsteps, the sound of someone walking back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I packed my gear, threw it into the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. They didn't move, didn't try to hide, just stood there, watching me leave. I never went back. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The road twisted through dense pines, the gravel crunching under my tires. The deeper I went, the less I saw of civilization. I'd rented the place online, an isolated, off-grid cabin deep in the mountains. Exactly what I needed to clear my head. No cell service, no neighbors, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind whistling through the valleys. By the time I arrived, the sun had already dipped below the ridgeline, the sky bruised with streaks of purple and deep orange. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, just a simple wooden structure with a pitched roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dark, and the surrounding forest pressed in close, almost suffocating. I killed the engine, letting the silence settle in around me. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The place smelled of aged wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old water pipes. It was furnished simply. A wooden table, a chair, a bed against the far wall, and a small fireplace with a neat stack of firewood beside it. No electricity, just a few oil lamps and candles scattered on the shelves. The previous guests had left some canned food in the cupboards, but I'd brought enough supplies to last a week. I spent the first evening getting settled. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed, lit a couple of candles, and made a simple meal. Outside, the night settled in, thick and absolute, the kind of darkness you only get when you're miles away from the nearest town. It was quiet, too quiet. I noticed it then, the absence of sound. No crickets, no wind moving through the trees, no distant rustling of wildlife. Just a complete, unnatural stillness. Pressed in on me, made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. I was just getting used to being alone, that's all. That night, I struggled to sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, but it was more than that. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, stale. The silence didn't help. I kept thinking I could hear something just outside. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found something odd. Near the porch, the dirt had been disturbed. It looked like drag marks leading toward the tree line, like something heavy had been pulled through the soil. I stared at them for a while, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe an animal? A bear? Maybe? But there were no tracks, just the long, uneven grooves. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease. The woods were thick and tangled, the air damp and cool. I saw no signs of other people, no trails, no campsites, nothing. Just endless trees stretching in every direction. At some point, I realized I was walking in circles. I recognized the same fallen log, the same gnarled tree with its roots half exposed. I hadn't strayed from my path, I was sure of it. And yet I was looping back. I turned back toward the cabin. The unease in my stomach twisted tighter with every step. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low again. I stepped onto the porch and saw something that made my breath catch. The door was open. I knew I had closed it. I was certain. My hand had turned the latch. My gut screamed at me to leave, get in the car and go. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped inside, slow and careful. Nothing looked disturbed. My bag was still on the bed. The food I had left on the table was untouched. But the air inside felt different, colder, like someone had been here, standing in the same space I now occupied. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I kept the oil lamp burning, the faint flickering light the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I barely slept, listening to every creak, every groan of the old wood shifting in the night. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke to a sound, a soft, dragging noise coming from just outside. My pulse slammed in my ears. I sat up, heart hammering. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate. Something was moving around the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My eyes locked on the window, watching for any sign of movement. And then, a shadow passed by. Tall, human-shaped, but wrong. Too thin. The way it moved sent ice down my spine. Slow and unhurried. Like it knew I was inside. Like it knew I was watching. I stayed frozen, listening as it circled the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. I waited until dawn before moving. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, there were no tracks. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had seen. I packed my things in record time. I didn't bother eating. I threw my bag in the car, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. The entire drive down the mountain, I felt watched. Every turn in the road, every stretch of trees lining the gravel, I felt something just beyond my vision, just out of reach. It wasn't until I reached the highway, miles away from the cabin, that the feeling finally eased. That night, I booked a hotel. I locked the door, triple-checked it, and slept with the lights on. I never went back. Weeks later, I checked the listing online. It was gone. No records of the cabin, no reviews, nothing. Like it had never existed. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I'll never go that deep into the woods alone again. I don't know why I thought going to the cabin alone was a good idea. It wasn't my cabin. It belonged to my uncle, but he hadn't used it in years. It sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, and was practically forgotten. I remember visiting it as a kid, but I hadn't been back since. Now, as an adult, I needed a break from everything. Work, people, the noise of the city. So I figured a week of solitude in a remote cabin would be perfect. Getting there wasn't easy. The last stretch of road was a barely visible dirt path, overgrown and rough, winding through dense trees. My truck barely made it through without getting scratched up. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already low. It was exactly how I remembered it. Small, old, made of dark wood with a sagging porch and a roof covered in pine needles. The air smelled of damp earth and trees. Felt abandoned. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under my boots. The door was locked, but I had the key. When I pushed it open, a wave of stale air hit me. Dust clung to every surface. Cobwebs hung in the corners. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, my uncle had mentioned the power probably wouldn't work. I had brought a generator, but I didn't feel like setting it up just yet. I lit a couple of lanterns instead, their dim glow making the shadows seem even deeper. The inside of the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a fireplace, and a single bed pushed up against the far wall. There was a door leading to a tiny bathroom, but I wasn't expecting much from it. The cabin had a well for water, and I had packed plenty of supplies. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning, dusting off the bed, sweeping the floor, making sure there weren't any critters nesting inside. As the sun set, the woods outside grew darker than I expected. The kind of darkness you don't get in the city. No streetlights, no distant glow of buildings, just black trees stretching into the night. I ate a quick meal, then decided to sit on the porch for a bit. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves, probably just the wind. But every now and then, I thought I heard something else. A faint snap of a twig, the shuffle of something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. As the night stretched on, the feeling of unease grew. The cabin felt smaller. The woods felt bigger. I kept looking toward the tree line, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just darkness. The wind picked up, making the trees creak. It sounded almost like voices, but I knew that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to head inside and lock up for the night. As I bolted the door, I heard something outside. A crunch. Footsteps? No, had to be an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, sweeping the beam across the porch and yard. Nothing. But then I saw something strange. The dirt in front of the cabin looked disturbed, like something had been dragged across it. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe a branch had fallen, or a raccoon had been digging around. I forced myself to ignore it and lay down in bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made me tense up. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, not because of a noise, but because of the absence of one. The wind had stopped. The forest was silent, too silent. I turned over, trying to shake the feeling off, but then I noticed something. The lantern I had left on the table was out. I was sure I had left it burning low, but now the room was pitch black. I reached for my flashlight. As I clicked it on, the beam swept across the cabin and landed on the front door. The bolt was unlocked. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it before bed. I sat up slowly, listening. Nothing, just my own breathing, too loud in the quiet room. I stood up, careful not to make a sound, and stepped toward the door. The floor creaked under me. I winced. If someone was inside, they knew I was awake now. I held my breath and yanked the door open. Flashlight pointed out. The porch was empty. The yard was empty, but the dirt in front of the cabin, the disturbed patch had changed. The marks in the soil were deeper now, longer, as if something heavy had been dragged right up to the porch steps. Something had been here. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. My mind raced. If someone had been outside, where were they now? Hiding? Watching? My flashlight beam bounced around the room as my hands shook. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and my bag, shoving everything inside without caring about neatness. As I reached for my boots, I stopped. They weren't where I had left them. I had set them by the door, but now they were halfway across the room. Someone had been inside. My pulse pounded. I had to go. Now, I threw the door open and ran to my truck, my flashlight shaking wildly as I scanned the tree line. I saw nothing, but I felt something, the overwhelming sense of being watched. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, my tires spinning in the dirt. As I turned onto the overgrown path, my headlights swept across the cabin one last time. And that's when I saw it. Just beyond the porch, half hidden in the trees, a figure, not an animal, not a trick of the light, person, standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop to get a better look. I gunned it down the dirt road, not caring about the branches scraping against my truck. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, and even then, I kept going all the way back to town. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. My uncle sold the place a few months later. I didn't tell him what happened. He wouldn't have believed me anyway, but I believe it. And I know one thing for sure. I was not alone in that cabin. I had always loved being alone in the woods. Something about the quiet, the way the trees swallowed up the world outside, made me feel at peace. So when I found a cabin for rent deep in the Montana wilderness, miles from the nearest town, I jumped at the opportunity. A week of solitude, hiking, and just breathing in the untouched air sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive up was long, over an hour on paved roads and another 2 on a dirt path that barely passed for a road. The further I got from civilization, the less I saw any signs of other people. No cars, no houses, just trees, mountains, and the occasional deer staring at me from the brush. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping low behind the peaks. It was small but well-built. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, a stone chimney. A front porch with a single rocking chair faced the dense forest. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, breathing in the crisp air. There was a single shed about 30 yards behind the cabin, padlocked shut. Other than that, nothing but trees and silence. Inside, the place was simple. 1 bedroom, a small bathroom, a kitchen with a gas stove and an old refrigerator. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner for heat, and there was a small table with 2 chairs. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, powered by a generator out back. No TV, no radio, just the quiet hum of the fridge and the crackle of the fire I started in the stove. The first night was peaceful. I made myself a simple meal, sat on the porch for a while and watched the stars. The silence was absolute. No distant highway noise, no hum of a plane overhead, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of some animal in the underbrush. I slept like a rock, but sometime in the early hours I woke up. Not to a noise exactly, but to a feeling, a heaviness in my chest, like something wasn't right. The cabin was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of dying embers in the stove. I listened, heart pounding. Nothing, just the wind outside. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar setting messing with my head and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I took a long hike. I followed a barely there trail up a ridge that overlooked miles of untouched forest. I could see a river snaking through the valley below, the only sign of movement in an otherwise frozen landscape. It felt good to be out there, breathing air that hadn't passed through 1,000 car engines. I was gone most of the day. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already setting. As I stepped onto the porch, I had a strange feeling, like something was different. I glanced at the door, the windows. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling didn't leave. Inside, everything was as I left it. The fire was out, the dishes from breakfast still on the counter. But the air felt heavier, somehow. Diller. That night, I locked the door. It wasn't paranoia, just a habit. I'd be stupid not to lock up in the middle of nowhere. I sat by the fire, reading until my eyes got heavy. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke with a start, heart hammering. Took me a moment to realize why. The rocking chair on the porch was moving. I could hear the slow, steady creak through the thin walls of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. Wind, I told myself. Just the wind. But there was no wind. The trees were still. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped to the door, pressing my ear against it. The creaking stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, every muscle in my body tight. Then, slowly, I lifted the curtain covering the small window next to the door. The chair was empty. It rocked gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. My mouth went dry. I turned the flashlight off. The only light came from the dim glow of the fire behind me. I stood there listening, waiting. After a few minutes, I forced myself to open the door and step outside. Nothing, just the cold night air, the dark trees pressing in around me. But that feeling, that suffocating wrongness, settled deep in my gut. I went back inside and locked the door. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made my skin crawl. The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just my imagination, maybe some animal brushing past the chair. Still, I checked around the cabin. No tracks in the dirt, no signs of anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third night, the paranoia had set in. I moved the table in front of the door before going to bed. I kept the flashlight within reach. I forced myself to sleep, but again, something woke me. A noise outside, a low, shuffling sound, like footsteps. Not an animal, something heavier. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. Could be a bear, but bears didn't act like this. They didn't linger. They didn't circle. Then the handle on the door rattled. I sat up so fast I nearly knocked over the lamp. My pulse pounded in my ears. The handle rattled again, harder this time, as if someone was testing the lock. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The first thing I did was check outside. The ground was damp from a light rain overnight, and there, right in front of the door, were footprints. Human, barefoot. They led from the woods, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the trees. I left that morning, threw my gear in the truck and didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. Whatever it was, it had been watching me. It had been waiting, I never went back to that cabin. I don't even know if it's still there. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear it. The slow, steady creak of a rocking chair moving in the dark. I don't remember exactly when I first saw the cabin. I had been driving for hours, maybe even a full day, winding through the back roads of some nowhere town. The GPS had long since lost signal, and the last gas station I passed had been boarded up, rusted out pumps standing like skeletons in the gravel lot. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore, but I saw the cabin. The road was nothing more than a dirt path at that point, swallowed by thick trees on both sides, their branches interlocking overhead like fingers grasping at the sky. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, the beams catching glimpses of movement in the underbrush. Deer, probably, or something else. I wasn't looking for the cabin. I hadn't planned on stopping, but I was exhausted, my arms sore from gripping the wheel, my eyes aching from staring into the road ahead. The tank was low. My options were limited. So when I saw the outline of the structure, barely visible beyond the trees, something in me decided. The place looked abandoned. No lights, no smoke curling from a chimney. Just a dark, slouched building, its wooden walls gray and splintered with age. The windows were black, like hollowed-out eyes watching my car roll to a stop in front of it. The porch sagged, and the railing was half-collapsed, leaning like an old man barely holding himself up. But it had a roof. For walls, shelter. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was unsettling. No crickets, no wind, just the faint ringing in my ears from the long drive. I reached for my phone out of habit, but the screen was nothing but a dim reflection of my face. No service. Figures. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cool night air. The leaves rustled under my boots as I approached the front steps. Up close, the place looked even worse. The wood beneath my feet groaned as I stepped onto the porch, and something skittered away in the darkness. A rat, maybe, or something bigger. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. I pushed it open, and the hinges let out a dry, wheezing groan. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. My flashlight beam swept across the room. A single space with an old fireplace, a wooden table, and a moth-eaten couch pushed up against the far wall. There was a doorway leading to what I assumed was a bedroom, but I didn't check. I just needed to rest. I dragged my duffel bag inside, shutting the door behind me. The lock was broken, but I shoved a chair against the handle. It wasn't much, but it was something. The couch was stiff, the fabric rough against my arms. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and closed my eyes, just for a little while, just until morning. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me. It was faint at first, just a creak, like the house settling. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate sound, a footstep. My eyes snapped open, but I didn't move. I held my breath, listening. Another step, closer this time. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something just beyond my line of sight. I gripped the flashlight, my fingers tightening around the cold metal. My mind scrambled for explanations. The wind? An animal? The place was old. Maybe it was just shifting under its own weight. Then I heard breathing. It wasn't mine. It was slow, heavy. Something was inside the cabin with me. I forced myself to stay still. My heart pounded so hard I swore it would give me away. The sound of breathing grew louder, closer. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest. I counted the seconds, willing myself to stay quiet. 1, 2, 3. Then, nothing. The breathing stopped. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't move for a long time. I kept my grip on the flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I finally dared to move, I did it slowly, inching my fingers toward my duffel bag. My hand closed around the handle of the hunting knife I kept inside. I pulled it free, the weight of it familiar, grounding. I sat up, flashlight raised, beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty. I swallowed hard. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge from the drive, from the isolation. But I didn't believe that. My gut told me I wasn't alone. I needed to get out. I reached for my bag, slinging it over my shoulder as quietly as possible. Every movement felt agonizingly loud in the stillness. I moved toward the door, careful, slow. My fingers brushed against the chair I had wedged against the handle. Then I heard it, a whisper of movement. Just behind me, I turned, flashlight cutting through the darkness, and caught the briefest glimpse of something disappearing into the bedroom doorway. A shape, a shadow, too fast to make out. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the chair away and threw open the door, my boots pounding against the porch as I bolted to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, headlights flooding the cabin with light. And for a split second, I saw it. The figure, standing just inside the doorway, watching me. I didn't stay to look longer. I slammed the car into reverse, tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the sun rose, until I found a gas station with a payphone. My hands were still shaking as I dialed for help. But when the police arrived at the cabin, there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just an empty, rotting building in the middle of nowhere. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know someone else was there with me. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full week alone in a remote cabin, surrounded by nothing but miles of dense forest and the occasional winding dirt road. No cell service, no distractions, just me, a stocked pantry, and the quiet. It was exactly what I needed after the last few months of stress at work. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. I had booked it through an old-fashioned rental service that specialized in isolated retreats, the kind of place where people go when they want to be completely off the grid. When I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long, cool shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small but well-kept. A single-story structure with a sloped metal roof, a wide porch, and a fire pit a few yards away. A narrow gravel driveway wound back into the trees, disappearing from view. I unloaded my supplies quickly, wanting to get settled before dark. I had packed enough food for the week, a few books, a hunting knife I always brought on trips like this, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The cabin had a basic propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and a hand pump for water out back. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire, ate a simple meal, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional rustling in the underbrush outside or the wind shifting through the trees. It took me a while to fall asleep, but once I did, I slept deeply. The next day was much of the same. I spent most of the morning hiking a narrow trail behind the cabin, enjoying the crisp air and the way the sunlight filtered through the dense canopy. I found a small creek about a mile out, the water clear and ice cold. I followed it for a while before turning back, making sure to keep my bearings. That night, I built another fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in with my book. I had just started to doze off when I heard something outside. A sharp, distinct crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze. My first thought was that it was just an animal. Plenty of wildlife lived in these woods. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But something about the sound unsettled me. It had been deliberate, not the random noise of an animal moving through the underbrush. I listened, holding my breath, but the night had gone still again. After a few minutes, I shook it off and went to bed, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but near the porch, I noticed something odd. The leaves had been disturbed, kicked aside in a pattern that didn't look natural. My stomach tightened as I followed the marks around the side of the cabin. There, just beneath the window, was a clear impression in the dirt. A footprint. A human footprint. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp soil. Someone had been here last night, standing right outside my window. I spent the next hour searching the area, looking for any other signs of movement. I found a few more disturbed patches of leaves leading toward the trees, but nothing else. No tracks on the driveway, no sign of a vehicle. Whoever it was, they had come on foot. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost and wandered too close. Maybe it was just some local checking out the cabin. Either way, I decided to stay. That night, I locked the door, made sure my knife was within reach, and kept the flashlight close. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was light and fitful. Sometime after midnight, I woke up with a jolt. The sound that had pulled me from sleep was unmistakable, the creak of the porch boards under weight. I lay frozen, listening. Another creak, then another. Someone was out there. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. My pulse pounded in my ears. I debated whether to turn it on, but before I could decide, there was a soft tap against the window. Not a knock, just a single, deliberate tap. I stayed perfectly still. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to break in. They were trying to get my attention. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a minute, the tapping stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps retreating. Slow, deliberate steps fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife and listening for any sound of movement. When the first light filtered through the trees, I finally gathered the courage to go outside. The ground outside the window was disturbed. The leaves scuffed away, but there were no footprints this time. Whoever it was, they had been careful. That was enough for me. I packed up my things and left, driving straight to the nearest town. I told the local authorities what had happened, but without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I never went back to that cabin, never even considered it. A few months later, I came across an old news article about a missing person, a hiker who had disappeared in those same woods. No signs of a struggle, no clues, just gone. I don't know if it was connected. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. Someone was out there that night watching me, and they weren't just passing through. I never liked the idea of being completely alone in the woods. But sometimes you find yourself making choices that go against your instincts. I had rented a small cabin deep in the mountains for a week, something I had planned for months, convincing myself it would be a good way to reset, to disconnect from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no traffic, no distractions. Just me, the cabin, and the quiet. The drive up was uneventful. The road twisted through dense pines and rugged terrain, climbing higher into the mountains. The sky was gray with the hint of a storm in the distance, but the forecast had only called for light showers. It took nearly an hour on a dirt road to finally reach the cabin, an old structure with a metal roof and a small porch that sagged slightly on one side. The nearest town was more than 30 miles away, and the last house I had seen was at least 15 miles back. Total isolation. I stepped out of my truck, stretching after the long drive. The air was cold, sharper than I had expected. The wind moved through the trees, making them creak. The sound of birds was distant, but other than that, it was eerily quiet. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The inside of the cabin was exactly what I had expected, simple but functional. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, a small kitchen with a propane-powered stove, a fridge that hummed faintly, and a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress. There was no TV, no internet, barely any cell reception. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. I spent the first few hours settling in. I stacked firewood near the stove, checked the water pump, and made sure the locks on the doors and windows were secure. The only thing that made me uneasy was the back door. It had 3 separate deadbolts, unlike the front door, which only had one. It made me wonder why. That first night was uneventful, but I had trouble sleeping. The sounds of the woods outside were different from what I was used to. A distant snap of branches, a rustling that seemed too close to the cabin. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Animals moving through the underbrush, nothing more. Still, I found myself checking the locks twice before going to bed. The second day, I went for a hike. I followed a narrow trail that wound through the trees, leading up to a rocky ridge that overlooked the valley below. The wind had picked up, bringing dark clouds overhead. I turned back before the rain started, but as I got closer to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints, fresh ones, leading up to my cabin door. I froze, staring at them. They weren't mine. I had taken a completely different path, and these prints came from the opposite direction. They were deep, meaning whoever made them had been heavy, and they led straight to the front door. But there were no prints leading away. I forced myself to move forward, my heart hammering. I checked the door, the locks. Everything was as I had left it. I stepped inside, my hands shaking slightly. I checked the small cabin, every corner, every closet. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched, of something being wrong, settled into my bones. That night, I kept my rifle next to my bed. I listened to every sound, every movement outside. Around midnight, the wind died down completely, leaving only silence. Then, just outside my window, I heard it, breathing. It was slow, steady, close. I lay completely still, my fingers tightening around the rifle. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound lasted for what felt like an eternity, then stopped. The footsteps came next, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I wanted to get up, to look out the window, but I couldn't make myself move. I just lay there listening. Then silence. Nothing for the rest of the night. In the morning, I found footprints again. This time, they circled the cabin. There was a set leading up to my bedroom window, stopping just inches from the glass. But again, there were no prints leading away. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe the wind had erased the return prints, that I was being paranoid. I tried to go about my day as normal, chopping wood, making meals, forcing myself to ignore the unease that settled deeper into me. That night, I barricaded the doors. I pushed the couch in front of the front door, wedged a chair under the handle of the back door. I kept the rifle loaded and within reach. And again, in the middle of the night, I heard it. The breathing, right outside the window. I barely slept. The next morning, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my bags in record time, loaded everything into my truck. But when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I checked my phone. No service. I was stranded. I considered walking the 15 miles back to the last house I had seen, but the idea of being alone in the woods, completely exposed, terrified me. I decided to wait until morning to try again. That night, something tried the back door. I heard the handle rattle, the slight pressure against the wood. The chair under the handle held, but I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, gripping the rifle, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. But it never did. The first light, I grabbed my pack and started walking. The road felt endless, the trees too silent, the air too still. I walked for hours, my legs aching, constantly checking over my shoulder. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, the outline of a house. I ran. The man who answered the door was wary, his eyes scanning me, taking in my exhausted face. I told him everything. He nodded slowly, then said, "You're lucky. People go missing up there." I never went back for my truck. I never even went back for my things. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had been watching me, following me, it wanted me gone, and I wasn't about to give it a second chance. I was looking forward to the solitude. A week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and the quiet. That was the plan, at least. I had rented the place online, a private cabin miles away from the nearest town, far from any main road. It seemed perfect, too perfect, maybe, but I was craving isolation. No internet, no cell service, just a solar-powered generator, a well-stocked woodpile, and a small lake about half a mile away. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch was a dirt road full of deep ruts, winding through thick trees. It was slow going, but eventually, I found the turnoff that led to the cabin. A narrow path, barely wide enough for my truck, snaked its way through the woods. I had to maneuver carefully, branches scraping against the sides as I crept forward. The cabin was small, made of old, weathered logs, but it looked sturdy. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and a stone chimney jutted up one side. It was surrounded by towering trees, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine. There was no driveway, just a small clearing where I parked. As I stepped out, the silence hit me. No hum of distant traffic, no voices, just the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. A fireplace, a small kitchen with an old propane stove, a single bedroom with a creaky wooden bed frame. There was a radio on the counter, the old school kind, and a stack of yellowed paperbacks on a shelf. The solar generator powered a single light bulb and the small fridge, and that was it. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern light, listened to the occasional hoot of an owl, and fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. The second night was when things started to feel off. It was past midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with dim, flickering shadows. I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but something felt wrong. I sat up, listening. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then a sound. A faint rustling outside, followed by the unmistakable snap of a branch. Not a small twig breaking under the weight of a squirrel, but something heavier. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a bear, though I hadn't seen any sign of one. Still, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and shone it through the window. The trees cast long shadows, but I didn't see anything moving. I went back to bed but didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found tracks near the porch. Not deer tracks, not bear. Human, barefoot. The prints were scattered, uneven, like whoever had made them had been walking aimlessly or staggering. I followed them a few yards into the woods before they vanished among the undergrowth. I tried to reason it out. Maybe some lost hiker, though I hadn't seen a single person since I got here. Maybe someone camping nearby, though that didn't explain why they'd be wandering barefoot in the middle of the night. I spent the day fishing at the lake, trying to push the unease from my mind. The water was calm, the sun warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, it got worse. I locked the cabin door, checked the windows twice, and kept the fire burning high. I was in bed, not asleep, when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I lay still, my breath shallow. The sound stopped near the front porch. A long silence. Then, a quiet tap on the window. I bolted upright, heart hammering. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another tap. Then, nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside, every muscle tense. The tracks were back. This time, they were clearer. They led from the trees to the porch, stopping just below the window. I was done. I packed my bag in record time, threw everything into the truck, and got inside, locking the doors. The drive out was rough, the dirt road more treacherous than before, but I didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a while, trying to steady my breathing. My phone finally had service again, so I pulled up the listing for the cabin. It was gone. No record of it. No rental history. Nothing. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to. I never liked the idea of staying in a cabin alone. There was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, cut off from everything familiar, that unsettled me. But when my friend Mark offered me his family's remote cabin for a weekend getaway, I convinced myself it would be a peaceful retreat. I needed the solitude, or so I thought. The drive took me deeper into the mountains than I had anticipated. The roads were narrow, winding through thick forests with no sign of civilization for miles. My phone lost signal halfway up, but I wasn't too worried. The cabin had a landline if I needed to make a call. The thought of being off-grid for a couple of days sounded appealing at first. No emails, no social media, no distractions. Just me and the quiet of nature. I arrived just as the sun was starting to dip below the tree line. The cabin was exactly how Mark described it. Small, rustic, but sturdy. A single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, an old wood-burning stove, and large windows that looked out over the dense forest. I parked my truck beside it and grabbed my bag, stepping onto the porch as a cool breeze rustled through the pines. The air smelled damp, earthy. It had rained earlier that day, and the ground was still wet. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple. A main living space with a couch, a small kitchen area, and a door that led to the bedroom and bathroom. Mark had left some supplies, canned food, a flashlight, extra batteries. There was a fireplace, but I didn't think I'd need it. It was late summer, and the air was still warm despite the cool night approaching. After unpacking, I made a quick dinner and sat on the porch with a beer. The silence was immense. No cars, no distant hum of electricity, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. It should have been relaxing, but instead, it put me on edge. I felt like I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia. City life had made me too accustomed to constant noise. Out here, in the stillness, my mind was filling in the blanks. I finished my drink and went inside, locking the door behind me. The first night passed without incident, but I kept waking up, listening for something I couldn't quite explain. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. Mark had mentioned a small stream about a mile away, so I grabbed my backpack, a bottle of water, and set off into the woods. The forest was thick, the air damp from the previous night's rain. The trail was barely visible, but I followed what looked like an old deer path. It led me deeper into the trees, where the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. After about 30 minutes of walking, I found the stream. It was wider than I expected, with clear water rushing over smooth stones. I crouched down, splashed some on my face, and took a deep breath. This was what I had come for, the quiet, the solitude. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were my own, but they were different. Barefoot. Someone had been here, and recently. The prints led upstream, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen another person since I left the highway the day before. Mark had assured me the cabin was isolated, that no one came up here, but someone had been here. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart beating a little faster than before. The walk back felt longer, the trees closing in around me. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, made me flinch. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, checked the windows. Everything was as I had left it. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. Maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I was restless. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan, their branches scraping against the roof. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, but then, just past midnight, I heard something unmistakable. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I realized, whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy. They wanted me to hear them. I reached for my flashlight and the knife I had packed. The footsteps moved to the porch. Then, a slow, steady knock on the door. I didn't move. Another knock, louder this time. I forced myself to breathe. Whoever was outside already knew I was in here. Staying silent wouldn't help. I gripped the knife, stood up, and moved toward the door. I kept the lights off, trying to see through the small window beside it. Nothing, just darkness. Then the knocking stopped. Silence stretched on. My pulse pounded in my ears. I backed away from the door, scanning the windows, waiting for something, anything. But the night remained still. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark, gripping the knife, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When the sun finally rose, I stepped onto the porch, searching for footprints. They were there, barefoot, leading from the woods, circling the cabin. then vanishing back into the trees. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and left without looking back. As I drove away, I realized I'd never seen another car, never heard another voice. Whoever had been out there that night had come on foot, and they had been watching me long before I noticed them. I never told Mark what happened. I just told him the cabin was nice, but not for me, and I never went back.